So you're going to be making some stuff. First of all, congratulations. That's a strong indication that your project is in a pretty good place. There are 4 broad categories of stuff that you can make. There's stuff that you're making for marketing or PR. There's stuff for a collector's edition. There's stuff you're making for the team. And there's stuff you're making to make money. Let's go through each of these things and talk about how they're different and what sets them apart. When you're making stuff for marketing and PR, you want stuff that is visible, that people are going to wear or use or display, because that's the point. You want this product to be out in the world so that people see it and show it. You want it to be recognizable so that when people see it, they recognize it as being from your brand. But you're also going to want to do this in relatively large numbers. So as a result, you're going to want something that's relatively cheap. Final point on this kind of stuff is you want something portable. I've been to a lot of conferences where marketing material has been given out to people and it wasn't portable, like a poster or something like that. And the problem with doing that is it ends up on the floor. And nothing looks worse for your brand than when your marketing material is on the floor of a conference getting stepped on by thousands of people. But there's actually a second kind of marketing material, something that's more targeted to your core fan. And here you're looking for something that's exciting and something that they can share, something they can go onto their Instagram or their Twitter account and talk about how excited it is that they won this cool statue or sweater or weapon. So both of these can help. The most common kind of marketing material you see is in that first group. For a collector's edition, the number one thing is perceived value. So what's perceived value? Perceived value is how much the person who's buying your collector's edition would think that this is worth. It's not necessarily what they would pay for it, but it's how much they think it would be worth. If there is an art card in the box, it might have a perceived value of a couple of bucks. If you have a statue, that's got a perceived value of $50, $60, $70. So the point of that is you need to assemble a perceived value that's above what you're charging for the collector's edition, because that's how people are going to make their buying decision. Now, obviously, perceived value is very dependent upon the buyer, so you need to actually get above that by quite a bit in a lot of cases. One of the reasons you've seen a proliferation of digital goods in collector's edition is that their perceived value is set by you. You say that this is a skin or a piece of DLC that's worth $10, and that's what it's worth. You've dictated what the perceived value is. I think there are problems with having a lot of digital goods anchoring your collector's edition, but that's why you're seeing it so much these days. The other thing is it actually has to fit inside the box, because this thing is one of the last bastions of retail. So it's got to go in a box and go to a store. If you're building something specifically for the team, then it's about team identity. You want something that they can use or wear or display that says, I'm part of this team, and that they can feel good about using or wearing or displaying. Also under things for the team are things like service awards, where people have been at your company or on your project for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. These are rare and things that people will display and hold on to. Finally, there are ship gifts. These are things that you use almost like a service medal to say, yes, we have successfully shipped this game. Here, I feel that you want something that can be displayed, but that also can be replicated, so that if they are at your company for a long time and they ship a lot of games with you, they can make a collection of all the things they've shipped. This could be a plaque, this could be a small token, but it probably shouldn't be something that's so large that it's going to be impossible for them to make a display of all the games that they've worked on. And then one other thing is, where possible, you should try to get copies of some of your more special merchandise from the other categories for your team. And then the final category is the money-making category. And this really comes down to much more of a standard kind of equation. You want to think about volume, you want to think about how much you can charge for these things, and you want to think about the margin on those things. But in this category is actually something slightly different, which would be products or items that have a signaling factor, that indicate that you're a real brand that's worth paying attention to. In that case, maybe the money doesn't matter so much. You just want to make sure that you're breaking even or making a little bit of money. So let's walk through some of the different kinds of things you can make and talk about them one by one. For art, there are sort of two broad categories. There are lithographs. These are high quality prints, usually relatively small. They might be signed, they might not be signed. These have very high perceived value, but they're still printed on paper, so they actually have very high margin. These are very useful to be part of your general merch in order to make money, but they also are good for the collector's edition. They're relatively small, they're gonna fit in a box, and they have a high perceived value. They're also sort of like what I was talking about for a ship gift. Something that's like a lithograph is a shipping plaque. It's special, it's got a high perceived value, it's got that usability where that it can be put up on a wall, and it can be replicated like I talked about. On the other side, you have posters. Posters have a relatively low perceived value. They are seen as being relatively cheap. People really kind of give a value of around $5 for them. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They do have a very high going on the floor factor. These are the kinds of things that if you're going to a con, that you can often see posters abandoned on the floor of the convention center, stepped on or shoved into corners. So it's something to think about and be a little bit careful of. They do have a low cost. Usually they're printed in much higher volumes than the lithograph. So they do have the ability to be used in large volume. They can maybe be used for PR, but you have to be careful. They make good giveaways for people that are actually going to value them. They're probably not something you want to be handing out to everyone who comes to your booth. Statues are sort of the poster child for high-end merchandising. They have a very high perceived value. They're relatively rare, so people who collect things like them and will gather them together. They're pretty big and pretty expensive. That size can be a benefit. So one of their uses is service awards, or other things where you're going to give them to your team on relatively low cadence. They're big, but because they're not going to get that many of them, they're displayable as a group. They're a good anchor point for a collector's edition because people are going to see that as having a high perceived value to build your collector's edition around. They're also a good way to make a little bit of money. They're relatively low volume, so they don't make a ton of money, but their existence is a strong signaling factor to say and show that your brand is real and has value. Weapons are a lot like statues. They have a high perceived value. Usually they're quite expensive, so they're relatively rare. Often they're really big, impractically big, and quite expensive. They can run into the hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of dollars. They are really about signaling factor. They're saying, we are a big enough brand to be worth a company making a weapon just for us. But they can make money, but if you're going to try to use a thing like a weapon or a big prop as a moneymaker, consider making a smaller version. It's more practical. It can go on a desk. And also, you can use the larger item as marketing, essentially, for the smaller version of the item. People will go to a website to look at this awesome sword, maybe not buy the sword, but they might buy the smaller version that's a letter opener or a display piece. Apparel is ubiquitous. This is something used by almost all brands in the video game industry in some form. There's sort of three versions of this. There's the logo slap. What's a logo slap? A logo slap literally means you're putting something that looks like the box art or includes the name of the game on the shirt. It's going to get worn, and it is recognizable, and you can make this in volume in relatively large amounts. This is a good thing to use for marketing and PR. These can also be used to kind of pad out your collector's edition because you can make them small enough to fit into your box. But really, they're about that marketing or PR thing. You give them out at a con, they're not very likely to end up on the floor because they're actually seen as being worth something, and people will wear them. If you can get them out early enough in your campaign, they kind of serve as this background viral marketing that supports your brand. On the other side, you have in-world branding. This has a high perceived value. People will go and buy a shirt with an N7 logo on it because they want to be seen as being part of this brand and being in the know. It does require you to have some part of your brand that can be on a shirt without being obviously a marketing component. This is a great thing for making money. It's also a good thing to maybe anchor something for the team on. You might make a special shirt that uses UI elements of the game that you only make for the team. One thing to keep in mind with this sort of thing is it's maybe not a great idea for a collector's edition because high quality apparel is actually relatively big. So making a shirt that's of higher quality, it's probably not going to fit super great into your box. It's going to use up more space than you imagine, and it might sort of outweigh the perceived value of the average collector edition purchaser. But it can be done. Just to be super clear on this, the in-world branded apparel is the stuff you want to be special. You don't want to be doing this on the cheap. The stuff you're giving out at a con, people have lower expectations on that. You can go to the lowest bidder. But for the stuff that you're selling, that's got to be high quality. That's where you have the opportunity to do different things like hoodies and jackets, and you don't want to cut corners. Books are a bit of a special case. Strat guides and art books are usually a separate deal. Actually, most of these things are a separate deal, but these are big companies that usually have budgets. They can actually make a significant amount of money, and they're a strong signaling factor. So they're a really great thing to try to do if you can find a partner that's willing to work with you. Something like a pen and paper RPG is interesting. It's relatively low volume, and as a result is not a ton of money. It's a good signaling factor if you are an RPG, because it says, wow, this game is so big that a company is willing to make an RPG or an RPG system for this game. But interestingly enough, because it's relatively low volume, it doesn't actually make a ton of money. Before moving off of books, we should, of course, talk about novels and comic books. These are an excellent way to expand your world and tell a broader story, but you do have to be careful because they can be quite low volume, so you can't make assumptions that the people playing your game have actually read your novels or consumed your comic books. They're also a good opportunity for your writers to try their hand at something different. Okay, let's talk about office supplies. This is things like notebooks and pens. These will get used, but they're pretty low visibility. If you actually think about it, a pen is not really something that you notice where it's from when somebody else is using it. A notebook, you usually flip the cover and you use it open. So unless the paper is actually branded, it's not even obvious where it came from. They also can get a little bit worn out, so you have to be careful. These can live out in the world for quite a long time. So you have to think about whether or not you want to see something from a game years later still being used. Similar USB sticks, they're going to get used, but they can also age poorly because if you see a USB stick and that thing is only 16 megabytes, meanwhile you can buy a 2 terabyte USB stick for $5, doesn't make that 16 megabyte stick look super great, and that can reflect on the brand a little bit as well. Coffee mugs, these are interesting. They do get used. They do have visibility. In general, I would argue that most of these things are really about team gifts. They're good things to give out at team meetings and other gatherings where they are going to get used within that setting. They provide a good, strong unification of that setting, but they're not really necessarily a good place to anchor a PR or marketing event. They could go into a collector's edition, but their perceived value is going to be relatively low, so they're not going to be a useful anchor. That is far from a comprehensive list of things you can make. I haven't talked about lanyards, I haven't talked about many things, but hopefully you connect the dots and see how different things fit into some of these different categories. So hopefully this was useful to you to sort of give you a sense of what the sorts of things that are thought about when you're making different items and how the different items fit into different categories. If you did find this useful, please give this video a like, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.